In the aftermath of World War II, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Nazi-occupied Europe, they discovered horrors that would haunt humanity forever. Among the perpetrators of these unspeakable crimes were women who had abandoned every trace of human compassion. These were not passive bystanders, but active participants in systematic murder, torture, and degradation on an industrial scale. Today, we uncover the dark stories of the most notorious female guards who served in Hitler's death machine, and more importantly, how justice finally caught up with them. From the gallows of Hameln Prison to the courtrooms of Nuremberg, this is the story of how evil met its inevitable end. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of evil itself. At just 22 years old, Irma Grese had already earned herself a reputation that would echo through history as one of the most sadistic individuals to ever walk the earth. Standing at the gates of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, this blonde-haired young woman wielded power with a cruelty that defied comprehension. Grese began her career in the Nazi camp system at Ravensbrück in 1942, where she quickly distinguished herself through her exceptional brutality toward prisoners. Her superiors noticed her enthusiasm for violence, and she was rapidly promoted through the ranks. By 1943, she had been transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she would oversee the women's section of the camp. At Auschwitz, Grese's methods became legendary among both prisoners and fellow guards. She carried a braided whip and a pistol, tools she used with disturbing frequency. Survivors later recounted how she would select prisoners at random for beatings, often focusing her attention on young women and children. Her particular method involved releasing trained attack dogs on prisoners who had committed minor infractions, or sometimes no infractions at all. What made Grese particularly terrifying was not just her violence, but the pleasure she seemed to derive from it. Witnesses described how she would smile during selections for the gas chambers, how she would laugh while administering punishments, and how she took personal interest in ensuring that suffering was prolonged rather than brief. In 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Nazi positions, Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Here, in the final months of the war, she continued her reign of terror even as the camp system collapsed around her. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they found conditions so horrific that seasoned military personnel were left traumatized by what they witnessed. Among the evidence they collected were detailed testimonies about Irma Grese. Survivors spoke of her systematic abuse, her role in mass murder, and her complete disregard for human life. The British authorities knew they had captured someone whose crimes demanded the ultimate punishment. But Grese's story was far from over, and her eventual fate would serve as a stark reminder that evil actions have consequences. Coming up, we'll explore how this young woman's twisted path led her to become the first female Nazi to face execution, and we'll discover the chilling details of her final days before the ultimate justice was served. The Belsen trial, as it came to be known, opened on September 17, 1945, in Nuremberg, Germany. 45 defendants sat in the dock, including 11 women, but none garnered as much attention as 22-year-old Irma Grese. The world watched as evidence mounted against the woman who had become the face of female Nazi brutality. The prosecution presented a devastating case against Grese. Witness after witness took the stand to describe her crimes in methodical detail. Former prisoners testified about her systematic violence, her participation in selections for execution, and her personal involvement in torture. What emerged was a portrait of someone who had not merely followed orders, but had enthusiastically embraced and exceeded the expectations of her role. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from fellow guards who testified about Grese's behavior. Even among the notoriously brutal camp staff, she stood out for her excessive cruelty. Her colleagues described how she would volunteer for the most violent assignments, and how she seemed to enjoy the power her position gave her over life and death. Throughout the trial, Grese maintained an air of defiance that shocked observers. She showed no remorse for her actions and attempted to justify her behavior by claiming she was merely following orders. Her defense attorneys struggled to present any mitigating circumstances, as the evidence against her was overwhelming and her attitude unrepentant. The trial lasted nearly 2 months, and on November 17, 1945, the verdict was delivered. Irma Grese was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The judge condemned her to death by hanging making her the youngest woman ever to receive such a sentence from a British court. As she awaited execution in Hameln Prison, Greece's demeanor finally began to crack. The reality of her situation appeared to sink in during her final weeks. Prison chaplains attempted to counsel her, but she remained largely unresponsive to their efforts at spiritual guidance. On December 13, 1945, at 9:34 a.m., Irma Grease was led to the gallows. At 22 years old, she became the first Nazi woman to be executed for war crimes. Her final words were reportedly defiant, refusing to show any acknowledgement of her victims or regret for her actions. But Greece was not alone in facing justice. Across Europe, other female guards were being hunted down and brought to trial. Among them was a woman whose crimes were so extensive and so horrific that she would become known as one of the most evil individuals in human history. Her story reveals how ordinary people can transform into instruments of unimaginable terror. If Irma Grease represented the brutality of youth corrupted, then Ilse Koch embodied something far more sinister, the calculated evil of someone who had time to fully embrace darkness. Known as the Witch of Buchenwald, Koch's crimes went beyond simple cruelty into realms of depravity that challenged the very definition of human behavior. Ilse Koch arrived at Buchenwald concentration camp in 1937 as the wife of Camp Commandant Karl Otto Koch. What began as a position of privilege quickly evolved into something far more sinister as she carved out her own domain of terror within the camp system. Unlike other guards who operated under direct orders, Koch used her position as the commandant's wife to create her own methods of torture and humiliation. Her most notorious activities centered around what became known as her collections. Koch developed an obsession with human skin, particularly tattooed skin, which she would have removed from prisoners and turned into various items including lampshades, book covers, and gloves. This practice became so well documented that it would later serve as key evidence in her prosecution. But Koch's crimes extended far beyond these macabre collections. She established a reign of terror that touched every aspect of camp life. Prisoners learned to fear her daily inspections, during which she would select individuals for punishment based on the slightest perceived offense, or sometimes for no reason at all. Her methods of punishment were deliberately designed to maximize suffering while prolonging life. What made Koch particularly dangerous was her intelligence and organizational ability. Unlike guards who acted impulsively, she planned her cruelties with methodical precision. She maintained detailed records of her activities and seemed to view the suffering of prisoners as a form of entertainment or scientific study. As the war progressed, Koch's behavior became increasingly erratic and extreme. Even Nazi officials began to view her actions as excessive, which led to tensions with higher authorities. In 1943, she and her husband were actually arrested by the SS on charges of corruption and unauthorized killings, though these charges were later dropped due to intervention from higher-ranking officials. When Allied forces liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, they found extensive evidence of Koch's activities. The liberation revealed the full scope of her crimes, including detailed documentation that she had maintained throughout her tenure at the camp. Koch was captured shortly after the war's end, but her path to justice would prove more complex than that of other Nazi criminals. Her case would expose the challenges of prosecuting war criminals and reveal how some perpetrators attempted to escape accountability through legal maneuvering and delays. The question remained, how would justice finally catch up with someone whose crimes seemed to exceed even the worst expectations of human behavior? The answer would unfold over several years in a series of trials that would test the resolve of the international community to hold war criminals accountable. The prosecution of Ilse Koch became one of the most complex and drawn-out cases in the post-war period, revealing both the determination of Allied authorities to pursue justice and the challenges they faced in doing so. Unlike the straightforward case against Irma Grease, Koch's prosecution would span multiple trials and jurisdictions. In 1947, Koch was tried by an American military tribunal and sentenced to life imprisonment for war crimes. The evidence against her was overwhelming, including testimonies from numerous survivors and physical evidence of her collections. However, her case took an unexpected turn when the sentence was reduced to 4 years by General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor, who questioned some aspects of the evidence. This reduction caused outrage among survivors and the international community. The decision was heavily criticized in the press and by members of the U.S. Congress, who demanded explanations for what appeared to be lenient treatment of someone whose crimes were so well documented. The controversy surrounding her sentence reduction brought renewed attention to her case and the broader question of how Nazi war criminals should be prosecuted. Koch was released from American custody in 1951, but her freedom was short-lived. West German authorities immediately rearrested her and brought new charges under German law. This second prosecution was based on crimes against German citizens and utilized evidence that had not been fully explored in the earlier American trial. The German trial, which began in 1951, provided an opportunity for a more thorough examination of Koch's crimes. New witnesses came forward, and previously unavailable documentation was introduced as evidence. The prosecution painted a detailed picture of her activities at Buchenwald, demonstrating that her crimes were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of behavior. During this trial, Koch's defense attempted various strategies to minimize her culpability. They argued that she was merely following her husband's orders, that she was mentally unstable, and that the evidence against her was unreliable. However, the weight of testimony from survivors and the physical evidence of her crimes made these defenses largely ineffective. In 1951, a West German court sentenced Koch to life imprisonment for murder and other crimes. This time, there would be no reduction or commutation of her sentence. She was transferred to Achach Women's Prison in Bavaria, where she would spend the remainder of her life. Koch's behavior in prison was closely monitored, as authorities feared she might attempt to escape or harm herself. She was kept in isolation for much of her imprisonment and had limited contact with other prisoners. Prison records indicate that she never expressed remorse for her actions and maintained that she had been unjustly prosecuted. On September 1, 1967, after 16 years in prison, Ilse Koch was found dead in her cell. She had taken her own life, ending a story that had begun with unspeakable cruelty and ended with a final act of escape from justice. Her death marked the end of one of the most notorious careers in the Nazi camp system, but it also raised questions about whether true justice had been served. However, Koch was not the only female guard whose crimes demanded accountability. Across the Nazi camp system, other women had participated in mass murder and torture, and Allied authorities were determined to track them down and bring them to trial. While Irma Grace and Ilse Koch became household names for their cruelty, Maria Mandl operated in the shadows, orchestrating death on a scale that dwarfed even their horrific records. As the head supervisor of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mandl wielded power over life and death for hundreds of thousands of prisoners, earning her the nickname the Angel of Death. Mandl arrived at Auschwitz in 1942, where she quickly rose through the ranks to become the highest-ranking female guard in the entire complex. Her position gave her authority over all female prisoners in the camp, a responsibility she embraced with terrifying enthusiasm. Unlike other guards who focused on individual acts of cruelty, Mandl operated on an industrial scale, organizing mass selections for the gas chambers. What made Mandl particularly dangerous was her ability to appear reasonable and even compassionate while simultaneously orchestrating mass murder. Prisoners described how she would speak softly and calmly while selecting thousands of people for execution. She developed a reputation for being able to efficiently organize selections, separating those who would continue working from those who would be immediately killed. Mandl's methods were coldly systematic. She established routines and procedures that maximized the efficiency of the killing process, while maintaining the illusion that prisoners were simply being relocated or receiving medical treatment. Her organizational skills made her invaluable to the camp administration and allowed the killing machine to operate with unprecedented efficiency. One of her most disturbing practices involved the use of music in the camp. Mandl organized a women's orchestra composed of prisoner musicians, ostensibly for entertainment purposes. However, this orchestra was forced to play while selections took place and during marches to the gas chambers. The music served to mask the sounds of death and provide a surreal soundtrack to mass murder. Beyond her role in selections, Mandl personally participated in individual acts of violence. Survivors testified about her involvement in beatings, torture, and executions. She was known to personally oversee punishments and to take particular interest in ensuring that suffering was maximized. Her combination of systematic organization and personal cruelty made her one of the most feared figures in the camp. As the war drew to a close and Allied forces approached Auschwitz, Mandel was among the SS personnel who evacuated the camp in January 1945. She attempted to blend in among the millions of displaced persons flooding across Germany, hoping to escape detection and accountability for her crimes. However, Allied authorities had compiled extensive lists of wanted war criminals, and Mandel's name was near the top. Her attempts to hide her identity and disappear into post-war chaos would ultimately prove futile. The hunt for Nazi war criminals was just beginning, and investigators were determined to track down everyone who had participated in the Holocaust, regardless of how long it took or how well they had hidden. The question remained, how long could someone who had orchestrated death on such a massive scale evade justice? The answer would reveal the determination of Allied authorities to pursue war criminals no matter where they fled or how convincingly they assumed new identities. The hunt for Maria Mandel began almost immediately after the liberation of Auschwitz, when Allied investigators started compiling lists of SS personnel who had served at the camp. Her name appeared repeatedly in survivor testimonies, and her photograph was circulated among intelligence units searching for war criminals throughout occupied Germany. Mandel had fled westward as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, joining the massive exodus of Germans and displaced persons that characterized the final months of the war. She assumed a false identity and attempted to blend in among the millions of refugees seeking shelter and assistance from Allied authorities. For several months, her strategy appeared to be working. However, Mandel had underestimated the thoroughness of the Allied war crimes investigation units. Teams of investigators were systematically interviewing survivors, collecting documentation, and cross-referencing information to build comprehensive cases against suspected war criminals. Her name continued to surface in testimony after testimony, and her distinctive appearance made her easier to identify than many other fugitives. In August 1945, just months after the war's end, Mandel was recognized by a Holocaust survivor while standing in a food line at a displaced persons camp. The survivor immediately alerted Allied authorities, who arrested her before she could flee again. When confronted with her true identity, Mandel initially denied any involvement with the Nazi camp system, claiming she had been misidentified. The evidence against Mandel was overwhelming. Investigators had collected hundreds of witness statements describing her role in selections, her personal participation in violence, and her position of authority within the camp system. Documentation found at Auschwitz confirmed her official position and provided details about her activities throughout her tenure there. Her trial began in November 1945 as part of the broader Auschwitz trial conducted by Polish authorities. The proceedings revealed the full scope of her crimes and her central role in the machinery of death at Birkenau. Witness after witness testified about her selection activities, describing how she would calmly choose thousands of people for immediate execution. One particularly damning piece of evidence was testimony about her role in organizing the camp orchestra. Survivors described how she forced musicians to play while their fellow prisoners marched to their deaths, creating one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of the killing process. This use of music to accompany mass murder demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced prosecutors. Throughout her trial, Mandel maintained that she had been merely following orders and had no personal responsibility for the deaths that occurred under her supervision. She claimed that refusing orders would have resulted in her own execution and that she had no choice but to participate in the camp's operations. The court rejected her defense entirely. The evidence showed that she had not merely followed orders, but had exceeded them, taking personal initiative in organizing efficient killing methods and participating directly in violence against prisoners. Her position of authority meant that she bore special responsibility for the crimes committed under her supervision. On December 22, 1945, Maria Mandel was sentenced to death by hanging. The court found her guilty of crimes against humanity and mass murder, concluding that her actions had directly contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. On January 24, 1948, the sentence was carried out at Hameln Prison in Krakow. Maria Mandel was executed by hanging, bringing to an end the life of someone who had played a central role in one of history's greatest crimes. Her death marked another victory for justice, but there were still other female guards whose crimes demanded accountability. The execution of Maria Mandel was part of a broader effort by Allied authorities to track down and prosecute every person who had participated in Nazi war crimes, regardless of gender or rank. The hunt for female guards revealed the extensive network of women who had actively participated in the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. Allied investigators quickly discovered that women had played far more significant roles in the Nazi killing machine than initially understood. Across the concentration camp system, hundreds of female guards had served in positions ranging from ordinary supervisors to high-ranking administrators. Many had participated directly in violence, while others had enabled mass murder through their administrative work. The investigation process was methodical and thorough. Teams of specialists interviewed thousands of survivors, collected documentation from liberated camps, and cross-referenced information to build comprehensive lists of suspected war criminals. Photography archives helped identify individuals, while detailed organizational charts revealed the command structure that had enabled systematic murder. One of the challenges investigators faced was the assumption that women had been less culpable than their male counterparts. Early interviews with survivors revealed that this assumption was fundamentally incorrect. Female guards had often been among the most brutal perpetrators, and their gender had sometimes made their cruelty even more psychologically devastating for prisoners. Dorothea Binz emerged as another high-priority target for investigators. As deputy chief wardress at Ravensbrück concentration camp, she had overseen the systematic murder and torture of thousands of female prisoners. Survivors described her as exceptionally violent, even by the standards of the Nazi camp system. Binz had developed a reputation for personal involvement in executions and torture. She was known to carry out beatings herself and to take particular pleasure in devising new methods of punishment. Her role at Ravensbrück, the largest Nazi concentration camp designed specifically for women, gave her authority over prisoners from across occupied Europe. When Soviet forces liberated Ravensbrück in April 1945, they found extensive evidence of Binz's crimes. Documentation revealed her central role in organizing executions, managing the camp's punishment system, and selecting prisoners for transfer to extermination camps. Survivor testimonies painted a picture of someone whose cruelty exceeded even the expectations of her SS superiors. The hunt for Binz led investigators across Germany, as she had fled westward ahead of advancing Soviet forces. Her capture came through a combination of survivor identification and systematic searching of displaced persons camps. Like other female guards, she had attempted to assume a false identity and blend in among the millions of refugees. Her arrest in May 1945 was followed by immediate interrogation, during which she initially denied any involvement with the Nazi camp system. However, the evidence against her was overwhelming, including identification by multiple survivors and documentation found at Ravensbrück that confirmed her official position and activities. The case against Binz would become another test of Allied determination to prosecute all war criminals, regardless of their attempts to escape justice. Her trial would reveal the systematic nature of her crimes and demonstrate that gender provided no protection for those who had participated in mass murder. But even as justice moved forward against the most obvious perpetrators, investigators were uncovering evidence of other women whose crimes had been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and professional respectability. The next phase of prosecutions would target individuals who had used their medical training and scientific credentials to participate in some of the most horrific experiments in human history. The Ravensbrück trial opened in December 1946 in Hamburg, bringing together survivors, investigators, and legal experts to examine one of the most systematic programs of murder and torture in the Nazi camp system. Dorothea Binz sat among the defendants, her fate tied to that of 15 other individuals who had administered the camp where an estimated 130,000 women and children had been imprisoned. The prosecution presented evidence that revealed Binz's central role in the camp's operations. As deputy chief wardress, she had been responsible for implementing punishment protocols, organizing work assignments, and maintaining discipline among the prisoner population. However, testimony showed that she had gone far beyond her official duties to participate directly in torture and murder. Survivors testified about Binz's personal involvement in beatings and executions. They described how she would select prisoners for punishment based on arbitrary criteria, and how she seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. Several witnesses recounted specific incidents where Binz had personally killed prisoners or overseen their torture. One particularly damaging piece of evidence concerned her role in medical experiments conducted at the camp. Binz had facilitated the selection of prisoners for procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose, and were designed solely to test the limits of human endurance. Her cooperation with camp doctors in these experiments demonstrated a level of collaboration and atrocity that went beyond simple guard duties. The defense attempted to portray Binns as someone who had been caught up in a system beyond her control. They argued that she had been following orders and that refusing to participate would have resulted in severe punishment or death. However, the evidence showed that she had taken personal initiative in developing new methods of punishment and had volunteered for assignments that involved violence. Witnesses described how Binns had created her own protocols for managing prisoners, many of which exceeded even the harsh official guidelines. She had established a reputation among both prisoners and fellow guards for exceptional brutality, and her methods had been studied and copied by other camps within the system. The trial lasted several months, during which the full scope of crimes at Ravensbrück was revealed. The court heard evidence about systematic murder, torture, medical experiments, and the deliberate starvation of prisoners. Binns's role in these activities was thoroughly documented through both witness testimony and official records. On February 3, 1947, the verdict was delivered. Dorothea Binns was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The court sentenced her to death, concluding that her actions had directly contributed to the deaths of thousands of prisoners, and that she had shown exceptional cruelty even within the context of the Nazi camp system. On May 2, 1947, at 6 a.m., Dorothea Binns was executed by hanging at Hameln Prison. She was 27 years old at the time of her death, having spent the final years of her short life participating in some of the worst crimes in human history. Her execution marked another victory for justice, but the hunt for Nazi war criminals was far from over. The systematic prosecution of female guards had revealed the extensive participation of women in Nazi crimes, challenging assumptions about gender roles in genocide. However, investigators were also uncovering evidence of women whose participation had been hidden within professional and academic institutions, individuals who had used their credentials to provide scientific legitimacy to programs of systematic murder. Among the most disturbing cases to emerge from post-war investigations was that of Dr. Herta Oberheiser, a physician who had perverted her medical training to participate in some of the most horrific human experiments in history. Unlike the camp guards whose crimes were obvious and brutal, Oberheiser represented a different form of evil, the corruption of healing into an instrument of torture and death. Oberheiser had been assigned to Ravensbrück concentration camp as part of the Nazi medical establishment's involvement in human experimentation. Her official role was to conduct research that was supposedly designed to benefit German military medicine, but the reality was far more sinister. She participated in experiments that had no legitimate scientific purpose and were designed solely to test the limits of human suffering. Her most notorious experiments involved deliberately infecting prisoners with bacteria, viruses, and other infectious agents to study the progression of disease in human subjects. She would inject prisoners with substances that cause severe infections, then observe and document their suffering without providing treatment. Many of these subjects died in agony, while others suffered permanent disability. Oberheiser also participated in experiments involving bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. These procedures involved deliberately inflicting severe injuries on healthy prisoners, then attempting various treatments to see how quickly healing occurred. The experiments were conducted without anesthesia and often resulted in permanent disfigurement or death. What made Oberheiser's crimes particularly disturbing was her abuse of medical authority. Prisoners who were brought to her believed they were receiving medical care, only to discover that they were subjects in cruel experiments. She exploited the trust that patients naturally place in physicians, using her medical knowledge to maximize suffering rather than provide healing. The experiments she conducted had been approved by high-ranking Nazi medical officials and were part of a broader program of human experimentation conducted throughout the concentration camp system. However, testimony from other medical personnel revealed that Oberheiser had gone beyond even the already horrific protocols she had been given. Survivors who had been subjected to her experiments provided devastating testimony about their experiences. They described being told they were receiving treatment for illnesses, only to discover that they were being deliberately infected with diseases. The psychological trauma of this betrayal was often as severe as the physical injuries they sustained. When Allied forces liberated Ravensbrück, they found extensive documentation of Oberheiser's experiments. Medical records detailed the procedures she had conducted, the substances she had used, and the outcomes of her research. This documentation provided clear evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical research. The case against Oberheiser would become part of the broader doctor's trial, one of the most significant prosecutions of medical war crimes in history. Her case would test the international community's resolve to hold medical professionals accountable for their participation in atrocities, regardless of their claims of scientific legitimacy. But the question remained: how could someone who had taken an oath to, first, do no harm, have participated so willingly in systematic torture and murder? The answer would reveal the broader corruption of German medical institutions and the ease with which professional authority could be turned into an instrument of genocide. Dr. Hertha Oberheiser faced justice as part of the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, which opened on December 9, 1946. As the only woman among 23 defendants, she sat in the dock alongside physicians and researchers who had perverted medical science into instruments of torture. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her crimes at Ravensbrück. Survivor testimony revealed how she had deliberately infected prisoners with diseases, performed unnecessary surgery without anesthesia, and conducted experiments designed solely to inflict suffering. Her defense claimed she had been conducting legitimate research, but expert medical testimony proved her experiments had no scientific value whatsoever. On August 20th, 1947, Oberheiser was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. However, her 20-year sentence was surprisingly lenient, sparking controversy about whether gender had influenced the court's decision. The controversy deepened when she was released in 1952 and attempted to resume her medical practice in Germany. Her early release highlighted the complex challenges of post-war justice. While some female guards like Greasy, Mandel, and Binz paid the ultimate price for their crimes, others like Oberheiser managed to escape full accountability. The pursuit of perfect justice proved elusive, even with overwhelming evidence. The prosecution of female Nazi perpetrators represented one of history's most comprehensive efforts to achieve justice for war crimes. The cases of Irma Gress, Ilse Koch, Maria Mandel, Dorothea Binz, and Hertha Oberheiser revealed that women had been active participants in systematic murder and torture, not passive bystanders. Their trials established crucial legal precedents about individual responsibility for crimes against humanity. The courts rejected defenses based on following orders, gender, or professional authority, demonstrating that personal choice remained possible even within totalitarian systems. The ultimate fates of these women varied dramatically. Some faced execution, others spent decades in prison, and still others managed early releases that sparked ongoing controversy. These cases revealed both the possibilities and limitations of post-war justice, serving as powerful warnings while highlighting the challenges of ensuring complete accountability. The systematic prosecution of female Nazi perpetrators marked a turning point in international justice, establishing precedents that continue to influence war crimes tribunals today. Their stories serve as reminders of humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and determined pursuit of justice. As we remember these dark chapters, we honor the survivors who testified against their tormentors and the investigators who built cases for prosecution. Their efforts ensured these crimes would not be forgotten, and that future generations would understand the consequences of abandoning humanity's most basic moral principles. The bloody end of the most evil Nazi female guards serves as both a testament to the possibility of justice and a warning about the depths of cruelty humans can reach when they abandon compassion for hatred. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.